Welcome to this video on the centrifugal effect. If you like this video, then please like and subscribe for more similar content. We're going to start by modelling a scenario of a planet going around a star in space with an anti-clockwise circular orbit, and I've also shown its instantaneous velocity at one point during this orbit. We know that gravity acts between these 2 points because they both have mass. However, we're going to forget that we know this fact and prove it. We will ignore the planet attracting the star by a small amount completely because it's significantly small. I'm going to draw on an x-axis under my diagram, and the dot represents where it changes from positive x to negative x. So we're going to focus on it only moving left and right. The positive x is the right direction, and the negative x is the left direction. As the planet moves around the star, the amount of velocity acting in the x direction will change over time. Let's draw a graph so we can plot some points. The graph needs a midway point to represent the change from positive to negative velocity in the x direction. Along the bottom we have time, and at the side we have the x component of the velocity. So putting it simply, how much of the velocity acts in the x direction. At this point, all the velocity is acting up, which we are ignoring, and none is acting either left or right. Therefore, the amount of the x component is 0. We will plot this point at time t equals 0, and x velocity also equals 0. If we move 1/4 of the way around the circle, all the velocity is moving left, as you can see in the diagram, which is in the negative x direction. Therefore, this will be plotted at -1, and since some time has elapsed when moving to this position, we'll also plot it further along the time axis. If we move another 1/4 of the way around the circle, all the velocity is moving downwards, therefore none is moving in the x direction, and since the same amount of time has passed, it will be plotted the same distance again from our last plotted point. If we repeat this process once again, then all the velocity is acting in the positive x direction. It's all moving right. There's none in the y direction, neither up or down. And so this will be plotted the same amount of time away again and at the point 1 because it's all moving the positive x direction. Until we come back to the start again, and so we plot the same point we did at the very beginning because it's repeated the entire process. Then if we join all of these points up, we will get a nice negative sine graph. If you look at any point in between 2 we have drawn on the diagram, you can see that only some of it will be in either the positive or negative x direction. If you find a corresponding point on the graph, it will always match up. Although the velocity is constantly changing, the speed remains constant. The graph shows the x velocity changing, and if we drew a graph for the y velocity, ignoring the x velocity, it would be a positive cos graph. If you also do maths, you will know that the sine squared plus the cos squared equals 1, the most important trig identity. Since minus sine squared also equals sine squared, because the negatives cancel, This shows that speed will remain constant although the velocity is constantly changing. Therefore, velocity constantly changes, however speed remains constant. At the start, the x-velocity is 0, however it is becoming gradually more negative. This means a force must be acting on the planet in the negative x direction. This force must therefore be gravity, which we know to be true. This can be applied to any point on the circle, including the bottom, as shown in the diagram. Now we're going to redraw the scenario, and we're going to label the planet X and the star Y. And now that we've proved gravity is always acting inwards towards the centre, and therefore acceleration is always acting inwards towards the centre, we can include it in this diagram. And the two of these always act perpendicular to one another. If we take this diagram and redraw it on the side, but without the planets and the circle to reduce clutter, then I can show you something else. Because the planet is already moving up and the acceleration is pulling it left, that means that its resultant direction will end up being in between the two, because it's been accelerated left while moving up. And so I'll draw the resultant direction, and we'll call this velocity 2. Now, on the diagram on the left, I'm going to show you that the planet has now slightly moved position, and because it has slightly moved position, its acceleration due to gravity now acts in a slightly different direction, as I will draw on the diagram, along with its new velocity. I'll then replicate this on the right diagram again to show the direction gravity is now acting in, and again it is perpendicular to the new velocity. As this continues to happen again and again, then the result is it travels around in a perfect circle. Hopefully a little more perfect than mine. Of course, we have to remember that V1 and V2 aren't actually forces. We're using them in this diagram to show which direction it was already moving in. Since it wasn't accelerating in this direction, only moving in this direction, the forces in that direction were balanced. Acceleration always acts perpendicular to velocity, and this is what causes the velocity to change direction. Therefore, the direction of velocity constantly changes, therefore, so does the direction of the acceleration. Because as the velocity changes direction, the planet is in a new position, therefore gravity acts in a new direction also. I'm going to draw a new diagram. However, we now know that velocity isn't actually a force, therefore we can actually ignore it. So here we have planet X and the acceleration due to gravity going left. X wants to stay in its constant state of motion because of inertia. However, it's being accelerated towards the centre, Y, the star. Newton's first law states that a body remains in its constant state of motion unless acted upon by an external resultant force. This external resultant force is the force of gravity pulling it in towards the centre. Now we've explained all that, we can move on to a new sheet of paper for a completely new scenario and explain the centrifugal effect. So, imagine you're in space, away from any gravitational forces, and you're in a spaceship, and this spaceship is spinning. We're going to do it spinning anti-clockwise again. Similar to this ship, for example. So, imagine you are stood aboard this ship. As we explained before, when you're moving in a circle, there is acceleration towards the centre of the circle. And because forces act from the centre of mass of an object, it is acting from the centre of your mass, roughly in the centre of the person. And he also has an instantaneous velocity. Imagine for a moment you're the passenger in a car. The car is driving along the road at a constant speed, say 30 miles an hour, and the road is perfectly smooth, flat, no bumps, straight, perfect road. And you close your eyes. You can't tell you're moving. You can only tell you're moving when you slow down or speed up. When you speed up, the car pushes into you, trying to get you to go faster. You just want to stay in the constant state of motion that you are because of inertia, and so it has to push you forwards. And this makes you feel like you're being pulled backwards, even though you're being pushed forwards. And since in this case speed is constant, the speed doesn't affect how you feel. Since all you feel is the acceleration towards the centre, you're being pulled towards the centre because you're speeding up. As in the car example, you feel like you're being pulled backwards because you want to stay as you are, but it's trying to pull you forwards, but you want to stay backwards almost. And because of this, you end up pushing against the side, or the floor in this case, of the spaceship. And this mimics the feeling of gravity and ends up holding you in place. Because you're moving around in the circle and the acceleration, the direction of the acceleration is also moving with you, relative to you, the acceleration is acting in the same direction at all times, relative to you. Because of this, no matter what orientation you are in around the circle of the spaceship, you feel like you're being pulled straight down towards the ground. Therefore, gravity feels the same at every part of the spaceship, no matter where around it you are. Since the only force acting upon you is acceleration towards the centre, the centrifugal effect is an effect, not a force. There is nothing actually pulling you downwards, you're only being pushed forwards. That is why it is the centrifugal effect, not a force. And that is the centrifugal effect explained.